Israel recognized Somaliland, and just 4 days later, Somali President Hassan Sheikh Mohamud visited Türkiye at Erdogan's invitation. This recognition created a direct challenge to Somalia's territorial integrity, prompting the visit. While Türkiye and Somalia already maintained strong military and trade ties, including Turkish training for Somali forces and a Turkish base in Mogadishu, the timing and context of this visit carried particular diplomatic weight. Sheikh Mohamud noted that Somalia felt Turkiye's support during this period, and Erdogan highlighted agreements on projects such as establishing a spaceport in Somalia. Taken together, these developments show that when Somalia's sovereignty is threatened, turning to Türkiye is not only a practical choice, but also a diplomatic signal, reinforcing Türkiye's role in supporting Somali territorial integrity and implicitly setting it against pressures like Israel's recognition of Somaliland. These diplomatic reflexes that unfolding in just a few days make it increasingly likely that Israel and Türkiye could confront each other, not only over energy routes or territorial waters and land, but also at the diplomatic table under international law, potentially creating opposing blocs in the region. On a January 3rd, 2026, U.S. forces captured Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro and his wife, transferring them to custody in New York. While many people focus on the usual debates, I want to discuss a different aspect. I'm quoting directly the sentence of U.S. Senator Lindsey Graham, said beside the U.S. President, and I want to reflect on what these words could mean. U.S. Senator Graham on Maduro. He could be in Turkey today, but he's in New York. I think this sentence needs to be analyzed from two perspectives. First, he could have said it without mentioning any country, but he did. Second, why did he specifically mention Türkiye? For first question, giving a country as an example can be a diplomatic message to create contrast. New York represents the U.S. and the U.S. legal system. Here, as a contrast, he emphasizes that Maduro could have been in a country not represented by the detaining power, a country relatively independent in the global diplomatic system. At this point, the second question is, why this country is Türkiye? This is speculative, but we can reason. Mentioning Türkiye gives us concrete information about how the U.S. perceives Türkiye in the international system. Based on the previous context, we can say that Senator Graham presents Türkiye here as a point of contrast. You are now under the U.S. legal system, but you could have been somewhere outside it. Naturally, questions arise at this point. If Maduro had gone to Türkiye, would he really have been in a position to negotiate? Or would the U.S. have said that he fled to Türkiye? We cannot know for sure, but the fact that Türkiye is mentioned, despite the operation being successful, strengthens the possibility that Türkiye could indeed have been considered a genuine option. The question of why Türkiye is mentioned again naturally comes up. If Maduro had gone to Russia, China, or Iran, he would have gone directly to a bloc opposed to the U.S., and the public would have easily interpreted it as he fled. Likewise, if he had gone to a country like the UK or Japan, a close U.S. ally, it could have been seen as Maduro negotiating while remaining within the U.S. system. Here, Türkiye appears as a country that, both as a U.S. ally and as an independent actor pursuing its own path, could be publicly recognized as a potential place for an exit agreement. In conclusion, the fact that another country is mentioned as a possible place for an exit, even though the operation was successful, and that the public could realistically see it as a reasonable option, shows me that Türkiye being chosen is not just rhetoric, but a genuinely plausible diplomatic choice. In recent days, two separate statements shaped around Israel may appear to come from different countries, yet they point to the same mindset. The devaluation of international law in Greece in the name of defending Israel. An Israeli Minister of Diaspora Affairs, Amichai Chikli's explicit labeling of Türkiye as an enemy state, together reveal two internal reflexes of an Israel-centered worldview, articulated through different political contexts. In Greece, the recent debate shaped around Israel is not about who is right or who should be considered an ally. The core issue is, under what conditions international law and international institutions are regarded as valid. The discussion took shape around a statement by a Greek minister, emphasizing that Greece would remain in Eurovision while continuing to support Israel as a friend and ally. When this stance was challenged with references to Amnesty International and the International Court of Justice regarding Gaza, the substance of those references was not addressed. Instead, the institutions themselves were dismissed as ideologically driven and irrelevant. This reaction, rather than the original statement, turned a cultural and diplomatic issue into a broader political confrontation within Greece. As the Greek opposition opposed the minister's statements, arguing that international law and institutions are binding for states that recognize them and cannot be dismissed as ideologically irrelevant. This is actually where the focus shifts from Israel itself to the internal logic of the Greek state. The reaction from the Greek opposition is not an ideological disagreement over Israel. Rather, it reflects an effort to act as a balancing mechanism, emphasizing the institutional coherence of the Greek state. At the same time, this debate shows that how power differences between states shape the way international law is applied. The dominance of stronger actors over weaker ones in international law is followed mainly where states have similar power and political weight. This reveals for whom the law of the jungle works and how far its reach extends. This is not an irrationality of the state, but the action of an actor finding its place within the law of the jungle. Looking at the example from a broader perspective, the normalization of cherry-picking in law and the instrumentalization of international law could lead to the formation of power blocks in the long run. Relatively weaker states, unwilling to be left alone in the law of the jungle, may align with stronger countries, forming power blocks that could eventually lead to clashes. Moving from the Greek debate, the Israeli minister's statements reflect a similar way of approaching security and diplomacy at the level of individual actors. Israeli Minister of Diaspora Affairs, Amichai Chikli, recently gave an interview addressing Türkiye. This interview can be analyzed on two levels, one addressing the domestic audience and the other targeting foreign publics. In the following section, I will focus on the first layer, his messages intended primarily for domestic audiences. The minister defines Türkiye as an enemy state and proposes cutting diplomatic ties, including closing the embassy. He notes that the diplomatic representation in Ankara is already inactive, citing threats and incitement as the reason. As an example, he points to Erdogan's statements comparing Netanyahu to a controversial historical figure. Additionally, he urges U.S. advisors to reassess how they approach Erdogan and the radical Islamist ideology. First, the minister's use of enemy state is not just a diplomatic stance, but a normative and emotional label. These words appear to target the domestic audience more than foreign publics. Ironically, the minister suggests closing embassies he considers ineffective, which creates a contradictory statement and goes against the diplomatic logic. His framing of pro-Palestinian demonstrations as anti-Israel protests functions not as a concrete diplomatic issue, but as an emotional reinforcement for his domestic audience. Citing Erdogan's comparison of Netanyahu to a controversial historical figure shows how the minister mirrors Erdogan's strategy of directing his own domestic audience toward a common enemy. Finally, by urging U.S. advisors to reconsider their approach to Erdogan and Islamist ideology, he signals that his statements go beyond the Israel-Türkiye relationship and should be seen in a broader context. Moving to the second layer, the minister's statements target foreign publics and address Israel's security concerns. He insists that Turkish troops in Gaza are unacceptable under any circumstances, warning that their presence alongside the Israeli army could turn even a small misunderstanding into a major conflict. He also demands that Türkiye stay out of Syria, specifically southern Syria. Regarding U.S. relations, he acknowledges President Trump as a strong friend of Israel, but argues that Trump is making a mistake in his approach to Erdogan, calling it a double game with the U.S. The minister sees Türkiye as a direct military threat. His emphasis on Gaza, that Turkish troops should never be there, is not only a military concern, but also a veto within Israel's perceived security boundaries. Regarding Syria, he specifically mentions southern Syria, highlighting an area Israel views as a buffer zone or security corridor. This approach underlines a geographic limitation between rhetoric and actual presence on the ground. Overall, the minister's statements are framed from Israel's security map perspective, rather than against a single country. In this view, Türkiye is positioned as a risk that must be constrained in the field. The minister recognizes Trump as a strong friend of Israel, but by saying Trump is making a mistake with Erdogan, he shows that Israel can take a position independent of the U.S. The double game remark implies that Erdogan is playing both sides in his relations with the U.S. and frames Türkiye as an unreliable actor. The minister signals that Türkiye's behavior poses risks to both the U.S. and the international community. His comment on Trump gives insight into U.S.-Türkiye relations and Israel's on-the-ground security planning and regional strategy. Combined with the earlier emphasis on Gaza and southern Syria, the minister's perception of Türkiye as a military, diplomatic, and strategic threat becomes more comprehensive.